Adab, welcome to the fourth talk in our new series, Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities. This is a collaboration between the University of Exeter, Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, and Habib University's Department of Comparative Humanities. I'm Nauman Naqvi. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Humanities at Habib. In the academic year 2020 to 2021, Habib University's Department of Comparative Humanities and the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies launched a fortnightly webinar series titled Islam After Colonialism. The series charted the dramatic transformations under the devastating global impact of modern apartheid colonial rule in the nature of Islam in South Asia. It was a South Asia specific series, which this one is not, across culture, religion, politics, society, and the arts. The decolonial question of alternative paths and futures was an important part of the series, given that contemporary concepts and imaginations of history, religion, politics, and ethics remain hostage to the modern colonial heritage. This year, our new series, Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities, focuses on the spiritual, ethical, and religious resources that have been marginalized or obscured through the co-optation of religion by colonialism and subsequently its inheritor, nationalism. There could not be a better speaker for this series than our very exciting speaker today, and I'll ask my colleague, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, the director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, to introduce him. Sajjad.
Thank you, Nauman, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. It is a pleasure to introduce Professor Muhammad U Faruque from the University of Cincinnati. Muhammad is the Inayat Malik Assistant Professor at the University of Cincinnati, and he works on the kind of the cusp of religion, philosophy, and literature, with a particular focus on the Islamic intellectual traditions. Now, of course, I first came across Muhammad when he kindly got in touch when he was a student at Tehran University many years ago, because he was very much interested in Islamic philosophical traditions. And then, of course, he then went on to do his PhD with Asad Ahmed, a colleague and friend of ours at Berkeley. And it was also a pleasure recently to endorse his book. So his book, Sculpting the Self. Oh, that's how problem with these things, you can't see properly. Yeah, came out earlier in this year with the University of Michigan Press. It's called Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing. And it's a very creative work, which is a lot more than just a study of selfhood in Islamic philosophy. It is, as he calls it, trying to address this question of what does it mean to be human, and making, I think, a very serious contribution, as I think I said in my blurb, to a more global sense of selfhood, a more global philosophical sense of selfhood. Currently, he has a number of projects that he is working on, including the School of Ibn Arabi and the relationship between philosophy and poetics in the School of Ibn Arabi, as well as a couple of philosophical projects relating to the ethics of IT, as well as artificial intelligence, which, again, I think nowadays in philosophy, that's really where discussions and ethics are happening. I guess the other element might be something like transhumanism. I don't know if Muhammad's going to get involved in stuff like that, but we can maybe discuss that later as it is relevant. So I'm very much looking forward to his talk today, which is entitled Decolonizing the Muslim Mind, Islam, Spirituality, and Human Flourishing. So without any further delay on my part, I'll hand the mic to Muhammad.
Thank you, Professor Rizvi, for the very kind introduction, and thank you, Professor Naqvi, as well. And thank you both for kindly inviting me to this seminar series. And it's really an honor for me to take part in this conversation with someone like Professor Rizvi and also someone like Professor Naqvi. So As mentioned, the title of my talk is Decolonizing the Muslim Mind, Islam, Spirituality, and Human Flourishing. And so let me just kind of briefly summarize the main parts. So the talk is going to have 3 segments or 3 parts. So in the first part, I'm going to address what do I mean by decolonizing the Muslim mind. And then I'll speak for about 10, 15 minutes, try to about that. And then I'll give a specific example of decolonial practice whereby I'll seek to decolonize the term spirituality. And then finally, I'll talk about why is it important to decolonize the term spirituality and how is it related to human flourishing. All right, so what do I mean by decolonizing the Muslim mind? So anyone looking at this title must be wondering, what do I mean? What does the term decolonizing the Muslim expression mean? Here, and so let's kind of reflect on the first part of the title a little bit, because decolonizing already presupposes that someone or something is colonized, so there is a need to kind of decolonize. And so, but from a political perspective, we know if we're talking about South Asia, we've got, it has got independence, and that goes to colonialism, it's kind of over. But that's precisely the point. Politically, it may be over, but when it comes to intellectuality or even culture, I would argue, along with many other people, sometimes called decolonial theorists, that coloniality is far from being over. Actually, it's even stronger these days. It's even more pernicious in a way, because now we're talking about colonization of the mind. So, which, as we shall see, it's kind of worse than kind of political colonization. So if we have these assumptions in place, then it becomes clear why it makes sense to talk about decolonizing the Muslim mind. But let's try to also explain a little bit about decoloniality, which is the concept related to decolonizing. So this goes back to Fanon, Césaire, and in more recent times, Walter Mignolo, and prior to him, Aníbal Quijano, and then Sylvia Winter, and then Sabelo Cacciani, and many others. So these people talk about the need for decolonization and decoloniality. So according to decolonial theorists, decoloniality or decolonial thinking, it aims to delink from the epistemic assumptions common to all the areas of knowledge established in the Western world since the European Renaissance and through the European Enlightenment. So the project of decolonization, or the project of decoloniality, begins with this critique of the Western episteme. Because of these epistemic assumptions, now everyone takes for granted, and in most part of the world, people do not even notice when they're engaged in various discourses. So it is about delinking from that kind of Western hegemonic episteme, but at the same time, it means, to further kind of expand on the term delinking. It means from the pretension that a specific cosmic vision of a particular ethnicity should be taken as universal rationality, even if such an ethnicity is called Western Europe, because this actually pretends to impose a provincialism as universalism. So those of us who are familiar with Dipesh Chakrabarty and his work can think of him here. So in a sense, decolonial thinking aims to attain, after kind of this kind of delinking and de-Westernization, what Gacciani called epistemic freedom. So first, there's the question of delinking from the Western episteme, these common epistemological assumptions sort of imposed on us, and since the Renaissance through the Enlightenment. And then there's the question of gaining epistemic freedom. So epistemic freedom is fundamentally about the right to think, theorize, interpret the world, develop own methodologies, and write from where one is located and unencumbered by Eurocentrism. So decolonizing the Muslim mind, or decolonizing in general, it's about liberating the colonized mind, because the mind, the Muslim mind in this context is caught up in a Eurocentric labyrinth, if we are following this, this particular narrative. But one can actually say that decolonial thinking, people say, began after the post-war, after World War II. But one can think of Muhammad Iqbal in Pakistan, from the Indian subcontinent and now Pakistan, and his critique of Western epistemology and the need to rethink Islam. So Iqbal can be thought of as someone who already kind of started this project of decolonial thinking, because there's much in his writings about the critique of Western epistemology. But Iqbal also concedes, in my opinion, too much ground when he says that the teachings of Islam must be understood and interpreted in light of modern knowledge. So for him, although he's not accepting European epistemology completely, but he still feels like, due to the kind of developments in modern science and philosophy, etc., we need to kind of rethink the intellectual edifice of Islam in light of modern science and advancement in modern knowledge, rather than the way around. So, and he gives lots of examples. I'm not going to talk about Iqbal at length here, but just to kind of provide, let's say, some footnotes. So he tells us, we're facing this crisis. Modern humanity faces this challenge of crisis because of progress in modern science, which challenges the conventional understanding and interpretation of religion, etc. But the solution is not to have a complete break with the past, but rather we should confront the challenge of modern science and must kind of try to rethink the entire tradition of Islam while kind of refraining from rejecting it totally. And he gives lots of examples, like reading Bidel, and the famous poet from the 18th century, in light of Bergson, in one of the titles of one of his shorter treatises, Al-Jili in light of Hegel, selfhood, consciousness in light of general relativity, Iqbal putting his hands on a lot of different areas, Sufism in light of Nietzsche, etc., etc. So Iqbal kind of is steering, one can say. In fact, I think I've seen a recent master's dissertation about this topic, someone from Columbia, talking about Iqbal as a decolonial theorist, and I'm sure others have pointed out too. And I do think, yes, he can be kind of seen as an earlier precursor. But I personally find Iqbal's approach actually very problematic. This idea of kind of trying to rethink Islam in light of modern science, I don't think it kind of helped us to get out of the labyrinth of Western Eurocentrism or Western episteme, which has all of these assumptions. At the same time, before going further, I should also clarify, although I started with some of these ideas of delinking and epistemic freedom and so forth, and a critique of the Western episteme and all of that, but when it comes to my own approach to this topic, I feel like I have to also clarify some of my own differences with some of these decolonial theorists. Again, I'll just outline them. So I think that while reading these decolonial theorists, sometimes I get the feeling that they go too far in rejecting anything Western, for example, the Greek tradition also. Whereas for me, someone like me would consider the Greek tradition as part of the Islamic intellectual tradition. It has been absorbed into the Islamic tradition, and even people who have rejected it, Ghazali, and as many scholars have shown recently, like how, to what extent they were actually influenced by Avicenna ideas, which go back to the Greeks. And even when it comes to the great Sufis, even like Ibn Arabi, Rumi, generally they're very hostile to even the philosophy and so forth. But you see in Rumi, praise of Aflatun or Jali Nusima, he talks about Galen and Plato as as heroes. And then also even someone like Ibn Arabi, who has really nasty things to say about Farabi and others. When it comes to Plato, he admits, oh, this is the only guy who kind of got it. He somehow reached that level of self-actualization and so forth. So yeah, and when it comes to Mullah Sadra and others, so many examples like why instead of actually the West, Muslims have been the one kind of studying and reforming and taking things further. drawing on the Greek tradition, Greco-Roman tradition, and also, of course, Persian and Indian traditions. Of course, today people think exactly the opposite about Muslims, or they think Islam and the West, no relationship at all. Of course, it's not that way. So yeah, that part I don't quite, it's a topic for another day, but I feel like, you know, rejecting anything Western, it's not what I personally would go for. But I do agree that, you know, there are problems when it comes to that particular epistemology that has now become the norm since the Renaissance and Enlightenment, through the Enlightenment. And then they also tend to sometimes generalize a lot. For example, when they blame Christian theology for all the ills of all the ills that Europeans brought to the Americas, I also find it somewhat naive, perhaps, to blame Christian, because they're Christian theology as a whole for all this, because there are many versions of Christian theology. Just as there are murders in the name of Christianity, there are always some Las Casas and other, you know, Christian figures here and there who are talking against, you know, their fellow Christians and some of their practices. And also when it comes to their genealogies of terms like human, nature, and so forth, I personally feel like they simplify a lot, and they tend to pit the Western tradition against everyone else. So although I'm against Eurocentrism as well, but and I also agree with them that with the colonial theorists that after this critique, delinking, de-Westernization, we should opt for a kind of pluralistic vision of things. But my version of pluralism is somewhat different. So for me, if I have to define it, I would define my version of pluralism as something like this. Cultural and epistemic pluralism is the recognition that fundamental questions of philosophy and spirituality have been addressed by major cultures, and that there are multiple valid epistemological frameworks to address the questions of truth, knowledge, and being. And for me, this includes the Western tradition as well, even if I'm very critical of certain trends within the Western tradition, just as, you know, I have my theological or philosophical disagreements with maybe some of our fellow Muslim philosophers, theologians, but I would not just simply isolate the West, and I don't think that's a fair option. Anyway, but we should also mention, yes, sometimes you do feel like, you know, there has to be that kind of really sharp critique, because still today, despite the fact that, you know, we don't have political colonialism anymore, but there are a lot of, you know, Western philosophers, such as I heard Richard Rorty, who passed away recently, but I read a few years ago, actually a couple of years ago, when someone was asking him about having a dialogue with, you know, with Islam. And Richard Rorty, being one of the most foremost American philosophers, he said, you know, Islam is, you know, so far away from our practice, our beliefs and so forth. They first need to have enlightenment. Then we can even begin to think about kind of having a dialogue, you know, with them. I mean, this is just, you know, it's just arrogance, sheer arrogance. I mean, Hegelian Eurocentrism and a simplistic idea of history. I mean, this is just, yeah, I have addressed some of this in my book, and others have addressed. So if there are people who just feel like, oh, really, it's all about Europe at the end of the day, everything begins in Europe and everything sort of teleologically moves toward the European idea, then of course, you know, you do feel like some of these sharp critiques of the colonial theorists are kind of justified. But I personally would think that it's not about just one ethnicity, it's about the questions of truth being in knowledge and having dialogues about, conversations about, and let people kind of figure out things themselves, decide on their own. So with that kind of backdrop in mind, let's now begin to discuss how to, you know, the focus of this presentation, which is about how to decolonize Islamic spirituality and why is that important. And so this is a very specific example of the overall decolonizing project. It's so, you know, deeply entrenched. Practically everywhere you look, you do see the ghost of coloniality as an epistemic, you know, force. And but I should also like to mention here very briefly the work that, you know, Professor Rizvi himself has done about decolonizing Quranic studies, which is an excellent study of how to kind of think about an alternative hermeneutics, multi-layered alternative hermeneutics. and when it comes to studying the Quran. The same can be said of religion, even philosophy, all of these terms that we take for granted, even science, yeah, that's the term, everyone thinks science is just science. No one thinks about its particular, his epistemological assumptions and in a particular context in which it came into being. But everyone thinks there's the kind of universal definition of all of these words, and mainly those definitions are obviously European, and people kind of uncritically apply these terms to talk about the entire world. And so this is so deeply entrenched, when I try to talk about these things with the students, people don't understand because they think, words like philosophy, religion, spirituality, man, woman. I mean, what's wrong with that? This is just language. This is just English, right? No, it's not just English. It is a lot of Eurocentric baggage. I mean, there have been so many good studies, especially I'm just veering up a little bit, but one of the issues that we always have to discuss, the gender issue in a man and woman. And recently, there's this book by The Invention of Woman by this Nigerian scholar, Oyewumi, and she argued very, strongly about the imposition of using this term, which carries all of this Western baggage or biological determinism in the context of Ifa, one of the largest traditions in Africa, arguing that this definition of woman as being universal does not kind of apply in the context of Ifa. There's something similar is happening also here when it comes to spirituality, which is I'm about to kind of shed more light on now. So the question that should be asked is, can we naively accept the term spirituality and simply apply it to the Islamic tradition without first decolonizing it because of all of these problems that I just mentioned? The answer is no, because just look at the term spirituality today. There are books called Selling Spirituality because spirituality is so deeply today kind of linked to capitalism and so many financial interests. And it's even related to anything called religious anymore. People talk about it spiritual, but not religious. So in the post-Protestant, post-Enlightenment situation, religion itself has a particular definition. It's been privatized. It's kind of reduced to personal sentiments and beliefs, etc. But people still admire spirituality. Who does not love meditation? Who does not love yoga? All of these. And so spirituality is something everyone likes. And so there are all sorts of ways people define it and contradictory ways. So let me give some examples. So on the one hand, you have philosophers, analytic Western philosophers like Robert Solomon, Matt Zinger, for whom spirituality is often pitted against religion. Now you begin to see why this is so problematic. If we simply just don't look at all of these nuances and simply kind of use the term to describe our different traditions. So for Solomon, spirituality is defined as follows, quote, spirituality means to me the grand and thoughtful passions of life, and a life lived in accordance with those grand thoughts and passions. Spirituality embraces love, trust, reverence, and wisdom, as well as the most terrifying aspects of life, tragedy and death. But ultimately, spirituality must also be understood in terms of the transformation of the self. Now, like Solomon, the German philosopher Matt Zinger also kind of valorizes spirituality while chastising religion for being irrational, authoritarian, dogmatic, and even delusional. For Matt Zinger, spirituality is an epistemic stance of persons for whom the sought after form of knowledge is not theoretical. Moreover, spirituality implies practicing certain virtues, the chief among them being intellectual honesty, whose most perfect examples are none other than serious and sincere scientists. So Matt Zinger and Solomon seek to define spirituality on the basis of something non-religious, non-institutional, and non-theological. So spirituality is something good. It's rational, it's philosophical, and it's scientific, but it's nothing to do with religion. And obviously people would wonder, I mean, really, spirituality, but this is, it's the norm for a lot of people. So But even within the Western tradition itself, there are others like David McPherson and John Cottingham, who define spirituality actually in relation to religion. So one definition of spirituality is the following. It's a practical life orientation that is shaped by what is taken to be a self-transcending source of meaning, which involves strong normative demands, including demands of the sacred and the reverence-worthy. Spirituality also involves the cosmic dimension, or a concern for the ultimate nature of things and our relationship to them. So you can see when we look at the term spirituality in the current context, there are all sorts of ways people are talking about it, in even contradictory ways. It's pitted against religion. Scientists are the most spiritual people. You wonder, you go to India and you see all the sadhus, are these spiritual people or what? So you can see it's, like why the need to decolonize becomes so kind of crucial. So while I was writing my own humble book, and I entered in this domain, I entered into this debate of how to talk about spirituality in current context. I came to realize that there are some aspects of spirituality, such as flourishing, self-cultivation, self-transcendence, and the transformation of the self, that I would actually agree with. And taking the Islamic tradition as my starting point, also noting the Islamic tradition is a vast tradition. Spirituality here also means a lot of different things, but not like something religious versus non-religious. But again, there's a spectrum. But I felt like even after taking into consideration some of these crucial elements, all right, spirituality is not simply about being spiritual at the expense of religion. Let's say it includes the elements of self-transformation, self-cultivation, etc. But I felt like in all of these accounts, there's still a very important element which has not been accounted for, namely the self-knowledge. So I decided to incorporate the idea of self-knowledge because I felt for me, this is a crucial element of human flourishing, as spirituality is intertwined with human flourishing, as I'll explain soon. So for me, spirituality, I'll not attempt to when thinking about decolonizing this term, I'm not going to attempt a kind of global definition because, they will perhaps lead to just more confusions. So for me, it's about identifying at least some of the major elements that speak to at least a lot of people. So those elements for me are self-transcendence, self-transformation, and more crucially, self-knowledge, which is kind of neglected in many of these accounts. So what do I mean by self-knowledge? Again, it's a term that needs some kind of analysis. So self-knowledge, again, means a lot of different things. There can be self-knowledge in one's actual states, which involves simply self-awareness, and then sensations, perceptions, imaginations, etc. And then there can be self-knowledge in one's standing attitudes, which relates the epistemic subject to her standing attitudes. And then self-knowledge in one's dispositional properties, which involves the subject's knowledge of her dispositions, such as character traits, patterns of behavior, capacities, limitations, etc., etc. But there is also something called Socratic self-knowledge, which is being subject to the human condition. And it's different from those other forms of self-knowledge. So I'm now kind of drawing on some parts of this presentation from my book, and I kind of go into detail about these things at length. And but here I'll just try to kind of speak in a summary fashion. So we are talking about spirituality, and there are three crucial elements that define spirituality for me: self-transformation, self-transcendence, and self-knowledge. But again, self-knowledge means a lot of different things. So I'll try to give an explanation of different types of self-knowledge. But basically, all of these different types of self-knowledge can be boiled down to two types of self-knowledge, which I call reflexive self-knowledge. We all, by virtue of being humans, we have this capacity to reflect on ourselves, the reflexivity, natural ability to turn our gaze on ourselves and reflect on our mental states and so forth, and abilities and experiences, etc. But there is also, in addition to reflexive self-knowledge, there's also Socratic self-knowledge. So here's the crucial thing. A major shift from Socratic to reflexive self-knowledge occurred in the 17th century. So if you look at the major schools of Islamic philosophy, and I'd say there's even in schools in the Indian philosophy, and certainly also in non-modern Western Greek philosophy, you see how kind of Socratic self-knowledge, subject to being human condition, quest for wisdom, and reflexive self-knowledge, they're kind of broadly speaking, they were both considered equally important. But with Descartes, there was a major shift, because when trying to determine his existence and nature of his self, Descartes simply thought, oh, all we need is just a simply rationally functioning mind. And you just have your pipe smoking by the fire on a good weekend perhaps, and you just take a deep breath and take a deep gaze at yourself perhaps, and then lo and behold, you came to realize that you are just a thinking thing. Your nature is res cogitans, thinking thing, and it's fully transparent. There are no kind of question of moral and spiritual obstacles or your limitations, impulses that might prevent you from seeing your true nature that has been discussed so extensively by so many other thinkers across the globe. All that is kind of irrelevant. All you need to figure out who you are, self-knowledge, and this is goes without saying, it makes so much sense to us as people living in the 21st century. When you think of self-knowledge, we really don't think, especially in a philosophical context, perhaps, or intellectual context, we don't think of really spiritual practices that can be actually extremely important as we come to a better understanding of ourselves, having a true, kind of better understanding of our true nature and so forth. Because we simply think it's just an intellectual process. We just kind of need to have a functioning rational mind. And then we just follow the Cartesian method, and we realize we are thinking thing, and everything else is res cogitans. And I'm being a bit sarcastic, of course, but I do see the relationship between this kind of thinking, which again Descartes is so highly criticized again and again, and has been criticized so many, so extensively by contemporary philosophers. But his Cartesianism is still kind of, to a large extent, it still looms large when it comes to the kind of overarching intellectual enterprise in the West, and the environmental crisis in the separation of man and nature, humans and nature, it's directly linked to this kind of ideas. Of course, it also goes back to Galileo and primary and secondary qualities and law, others, etc. So here you can see, if you're familiar with decolonial theorists, yes, something, some genealogies are important. This idea of new human, or Sylvia Winter calls man one, man two, these transformations that were happening in the Renaissance in the last 500-600 years, and then to the Enlightenment being crystallized, they're now universal. People don't question these ideas on a philosophical level. This is not about religion, by the way, because on a philosophical level, I personally find them somewhat very problematic. All right, so so there is a relationship. It's not res cogitans. It's not the Cartesian thinking thing when it comes to self-knowledge, because there is reflexive self-knowledge. Yes, we can reflect on ourselves, but there's also Socratic self-knowledge, very much related to ethics and spirituality, which you don't see in Descartes at all. He talks about virtue, but in a context of kind of secular humanism in a way, largely, even though it's largely Christian. But then there is a great important relationship between reflexive and Socratic self-knowledge, because knowledge of the self consists in both improving our cognitive faculties so that we can perceive clearly and distinctly what does in fact promote our self-perfection and act in accordance with this perception. So the manifold relationship between reflexive and Socratic self-knowledge means that knowledge of the self consists in both improving our cognitive faculties so that we can perceive clearly and distinctly what does in fact promote our self-perfection and act in accordance with this perception. So it's not simply a matter of just philosophical knowledge, just figuring out whether we exist or not. In other words, It's not simply Cartesianism. So how is all this related to human flourishing? And why is this so important? I mean, with this definition, you can already see talking about spirituality and talking about spirituality in terms of self-knowledge and of course, self-transformation, another extremely crucial element. It's related to self-perfection, which in turn is related to human flourishing. So decolonial thinking is not only decolonial thinking is not only a theoretical exercise, and it's also a matter of praxis. And my talk so far has kind of already made it very clear. We're talking about spirituality, and came to see that Cartesianism is our starting point, and then it's very problematic because it's kind of very theoretical. The element of self-transformation can be very lacking in this context. So because it's about praxis and spirituality is about self-transformation, it is a key component of human flourishing. So I'm now coming toward the end of my talk. So what happens is, all right, there is a need to decolonize the notion of spirituality, which is linked to the larger project of decolonization of the Muslim mind. And we understand why that is important and so forth. There are some earlier precursors, Iqbal and maybe some others, but some of their approaches are highly problematic, etc., etc. And then we come to the notion of spirituality, and we see, in order to kind of talk about it in an Islamic context, one first needs to decolonize it. Because there are all sorts of definitions about spirituality today. So once we have an idea of spirituality in terms of self-transformation, self-knowledge, and self-transcendence, then we can kind of begin to see how this can relate to the question of human flourishing. Because when it comes to, so this brings us to the notion of the self, which is a huge topic. In the context of my work and my book, I of course talk about it first and then come to spirituality and all of that. But here I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritties of the self, and because it will just take a few more hours perhaps to just talk about what is the self and all kinds of different ways you can talk about the self. But from another perspective, we can think of the self as something that can be understood in terms of just human potential. So this is about the idea of what we are now versus what we can be. So when we talk about the self, there's an inherent normativity that is kind of linked to this idea, because when we talk about ourselves, it's not what we are today. It's not simply a matter of exhausting all the physiological details about my body and also maybe do all sorts of brain scanning and get more information, and also do all sorts of mental analysis and find out my disposition and so forth. It's also about what we can be. So oftentimes most theories only focus on what I call descriptive dimension of the self. So this distinction is absolutely crucial for me, descriptive versus normative. Because everything, because of the overwhelming influence of science today, everything is, and even in social sciences, people are simply happy to simply describe. So even when it comes to ourselves, people don't realize that it's not simply about description. It's also about normativity. It's not only about what we are now, but also about what we can be. Because if we analyze our day-to-day situation, perhaps many of us would agree that we actually live far below our moral and spiritual potential. So the perspective that I'm trying to kind of explain is about kind of making that shift, enabling one to transform one's ordinary self to a self-realized self. So it begins with a critique of the ordinary situation, because in ordinary situation, we're just ordinary human beings, caught between impulses and various tendencies, and sometimes we're happy, sometimes not. But it's not the optimal situation, perhaps. Once we have that insight, then we can think about a method, a concrete practice, a set of practices to overcome the ordinary kind of average situation in order to recover what this in the Islamic tradition is called the fitra, or the kind of primordial nature, the nature in which we're in a state of remembrance of God, and so forth. So spirituality is extremely crucial in this, because we, as Ghazali says somewhere, I think, only with true self-knowledge can one be happy. He who knows himself is happy. So self-knowledge is extremely important, Socratic self-knowledge in a modern, just reflexive self-knowledge, but also there has to be that element of self-transformation. The ordinary situation has to be sort of overcome through this set of spiritual practices. This is not just specific to the Islamic tradition. Haddo and others have made it very clear. Like we can talk about philosophy as set of spiritual practices. Here, philosophy is also closely related to spirituality. And when we talk about the Greeks, when we talk about certain Indian and Buddhist philosophers as well. So in the Islamic context, the goal is to recover our lost nature, fitra, which is exemplified at the highest level by the perfect human, al-insan al-kamil, through self-transformation and purification. So yes, and that leads to kind of flourishing that perhaps one is seeking. But it involves this process, this concrete set of practices, but given our situation, it has to begin with decolonization, and it has to begin with reclaiming our tradition and seeing things from our own standpoint. At the same time, it involves a concrete, it involves a praxis, it involves a set of spiritual exercises that are meant to transform the ordinary self toward a goal of human flourishing. All right, I think I should stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. You've covered so much ground and provided so much food for thought. I'd just like to, before I begin my some set of reflections and questions, I'd like to show everybody the title of your book. Somebody was asking us to repeat it. I'd like to show the cover of the book, so I'm going to share my screen. And here is Professor Faruque's book, Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing, Muhammad Faruque. Okay, we also have lots of questions in the comments, several from students, since we are using, actually, as I was telling you before this session began, we are actually reading your book for this class that we are teaching called Comparative Hermeneutics of the Self. We started with antiquity. We moved through, we read an essay by Sajjad. On Mullah Sadra, we read Jambet, Christian Jambet, his use of Foucault, Foucault's hermeneutics of the subject, to read Islamic spirituality. And then we are reading your book. Yeah. So this is really opportune for us. So we have lots of questions and comments, which I'll get to. But I'd like to just offer a set of remarks and questions before we get to those. So decoloniality, I think we need to distinguish. First of all, I don't think that formal in terms of the way you were framing it right at the beginning of your talk. Formal decolonization, which is what happened, say, here in our region in 1947. First of all, we should remember that it was formal political decolonization, but in terms of political decolonization at the global level, yeah, because the global regime is still an apartheid regime. I mean, if you look at, the United Nations, it's not a terribly effective body, but nevertheless, it's the only international sort of political structure that we have. It's obviously apartheid. Yeah, it's an apartheid. The Security Council has the former colonial powers plus China. Yeah, and of course, you can't be a member of the Security Council unless you have nuclear weapons, for instance, and very large militaries. The United States being number one in the order of nations at the United Nations. So, political decolonization actually has not happened. And in fact, I don't think it's really possible within the international nation state system for there to be political decolonization. So, and on the other hand, so I think we have to disengage also the question of decoloniality from what we are calling decolonization. Yeah, because actually the discourse of decoloniality is also very, very critical of nationalism itself, which the whatever decolonial elements one might find in somebody like Iqbal, and actually your critique of Iqbal was also very, very productive in our class, yeah, as we were discussing it, in which you crucially point out, yeah, that before Iqbal really, there is no ethically neutral conception of the self. Iqbal, who invents this idea of khudi, which is totally colonial, he himself says, you quote him as telling us that in fact, this is a bad word. In the tradition, khudi is a bad word, but he has to use it because he can't find any other word which is ethically neutral, which is somehow phenomenological, as if that which is phenomenological would have to be ethically neutral, which is, there's no such necessity in that. So Iqbal then is not really a decolonial thinker in the way that we would think of it today, because decolonial thinkers are also critical of nationalism. Nationalism itself is very much a part of the colonial inheritance. All of the categories of nationalism, and of course, Iqbal's entrenchment in the Western, that's the other thing that I'd like to point out. In fact, the idea of the West itself only emerged over this period of colonialism. There was no West before, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. The idea of the West actually coalesces and crystallizes over this time period. Yeah. And of course, then they create a genealogy for themselves, starting with ancient Greece. Of course, Plato would have been very surprised to learn that he was, part of the West, and that he was Gora, right? he wouldn't have understood any of this. And of course, the other aspect that they completely, both in Plato and in the figure of Socrates, that's the other thing that I wanted to point out for the benefit of students, etc. Yeah, that they completely de-religionize both Plato and Socrates. I mean, in fact, both Plato and Socrates are part of the Pythagorean tradition. They are actually, both of them, despite the charge against Socrates of impiety, Socrates himself is a very, very pious person. Yeah, in fact, he's taking piety to its limits in some very, very important respects. So the spiritual exercise or the spiritual aspects of Socratic self-knowledge that you are pointing out would have been part of that Pythagorean inheritance. In fact, I think Socrates should be thought of as the great renewer of the Pythagorean tradition in some sense. This Rorty, yeah, it's really amazing. It's these kinds of ideas about Islam. I mean, they make no sense. It's as if he himself knows nothing about the Western tradition. So the problem is not just that, in fact, Islam, his hateful remarks about Islam, his ignorant remarks about Islam. The problem is that they don't understand the Western tradition itself. Yeah, I mean, the way Plato is taught, for instance, in the West, shorn of all of these aspects. It's as if Plato never wrote the Phaedrus. He never wrote. I mean, forget all of the spiritual and religious elements and that are closely tied in with the philosophical elements. I mean, how can you take these things apart? So the other aspect of spirituality that is taken out. So one, it is delinked with religion, and on the other hand, it's also, of course, delinked with ethics. So spirituality is one thing, religion is another thing, and ethics is a third thing. All of them directed from each other. Yeah. Yeah, so those are some of the initial ideas that I wanted to get across. We'll have more of a discussion as we go along.
So am I supposed to comment, or I wait for Professor Rizvi?
You can start responding, yes, please, and then I have a couple of things to pick up, which actually links with some of the comments coming in as well.
Sure, and I just sorry, just for the sake of clarification, the questions on the chat, they will be read out later, right?
Yeah, we'll pick them up, as we can.
Thank you so much for this really helpful and enlightening comments. I completely agree. Yes, at the very beginning, we have to be clear about these terms. And of course, this is going to be only 30 minutes talk. So I just couldn't get into the, the nuances, because talking about decoloniality would make us talk about coloniality and then modernity and then colonization. And each of these terms has their own kind of explanations. They're closely intertwined. One can talk about one without the other. But I completely agree. Yes, political decolonization is still, yes, colonialism may be formally over, but political decolonization, the way you described it, still very much an ongoing phenomena. And this is very complex, so I'm not going to get into it, but I completely agree with all the comments about the United Nations and who gets to say what, and who has all the veto power and all that. I think it's clear to most people. And so the ideal situation would be some kind of decentering, polycentric world. But again, historically, it's not like, I personally, excuse me, I don't think it's this is about just the West, because if you look at the historical Islamic empires in Ottomans and Safavids, they also wanted kind of this kind of superpower status, and so regardless of one's kind of metaphysical religious orientation, one does see that there is a propensity to kind of be the best power and so forth. But from our vantage point as intellectuals, at least we'd want to have a more polycentric world, not like the situation that we have now, clearly with all these wars and so forth. And then, yes, so once we get that clear, then we talk about the epistemological aspect of colonization, which is about colonization of the mind. So the decolonial project here becomes delinking from the Western episteme that has become sovereign in the last 500 years or so and so forth. And the idea of the West, yes, again, some of these things are kind of taken, are so deeply entrenched, people don't realize the idea of the West, the idea of Europe before 16th century, when Muslims would refer to European, they would not refer to people from the Western Europe as Europeans. They would refer to as Franks and so forth, and something in very negative terms. And people would not even know where England is and so forth from the perspective, let's say, the Ottoman Empire, because. So again, that may not look very good if one is coming from a Western background. But again, we have to realize these ideas, they're not benign. As you're saying, Plato, in fact, Asia Minor is the place if we're thinking about the origin of philosophy. And if you're thinking of some of the most prominent Greek philosophers, they actually came from Turkey, Lebanon, and so-called Asian countries, at least in today's context. So this whole idea of the West is, again, of course, very problematic, but it becomes, and if we read newspapers, New York Times and so forth, this is the defining idea. There is something called the West, and it's enlightenment, it's freedom, its notion of gender equality and so forth. And other people kind of lack this. They have to catch up, and as decolonial theorists have explained, and others also. So these are very problematic. So we're thinking about a pluralistic world, pluralistic not just politically, but more importantly, epistemological pluralism, because that is more important in the long run. And then also the fact that if we're now zoom in on the concept of spirituality, yes, again, there are all these confusions. Spirituality is often pitted against religion. It's, as you said, delinked from the ethics, religion. Again, it simply does not make sense, to the vast majority of people, even in the West. But that's how the term is gaining more and more prominence. So unless we are able to decolonize these notions, and this is precisely about epistemological freedom that I mentioned, Gatsheni explains very well. And so unless we're able to decolonize, we'll not be able to kind of have even better understanding of who we are, from our own vantage point. If we want to understand our own selves, then, it's necessary that we are able to first delink in order to kind of reconstitute things for ourselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on something which I think a couple of people also raised in the comments, but and this relates to the question of possible obstacles or constraints in the process of decolonization. So perhaps one of the biggest constraints we have is language, right? So those of us who are interested in philosophy, we have the massive constraint of Aristotelian and Kantian language, which is, we just cannot get over, especially if we are engaging in a European language, particularly in English. And this is perhaps a problem. How do we decolonize concepts which we are articulating in English, whether that concept is religion, whether that concept is spirituality, whether that concept is empire or power or whatever, or even self. It comes with a rather heavy set of baggage relating to preconceptions and assumptions about how things work. And Rorty fits into that, but then not just Rorty, a lot of the pushback on Brian Van Norden, on his work on Chinese philosophy also fits into that. The fact that the people still have to say there is such a thing as Chinese philosophy is shocking, but it still is very much the case. So there's the linguistic constraint. And so then that raises the question of, well, if we are going to decolonize spirituality, what is it that we want to recover by using this term spirituality? And then if we want to think, I'm not trying to be a narrow philologist, but if we want to think what this term spirituality is, what are the concepts from within the Islamic traditions that map onto it? That would be an interesting question to look at. So you mentioned flourishing, which of course, the idea of eudaimonia, which in the ethical tradition is this notion of sa'ada, right? Sa'ada, which is happiness or felicity. Or sometimes you have notions of perfection like kamal. But what are the sort of range of things you're thinking about? And then beyond that, how do we retain one very important element of this? Because if you look at Muslim practice, both historically and in the present, we're not talking about a set of practices which are about internal states. We're talking about heavily embodied practices. If you ask most believers directly, what spirituality is for them, they will probably refer to something that they do, or something that they did, or something they experienced. And that experience was not some disembodied experience. It was embedded, it was within a society, within a community, within a communal setting, within a space, right? And so how do we deal with that? Precisely because it seems that, as you rightly said, a lot of the language about spirituality is divorced from the materiality of our lives as well. So I think those are the two kind of comments just to kick things off from my side that I'd like to raise.
No, thank you so much for these comments. Exactly, I think this is what lies at the heart of the issue. So it's precisely the question of language, and we have no option but to use English. And I personally don't mind using English, because I think by now it's also it's Islamic language, because there are lots of Muslims who are born in the West, and for them English is the mother tongue. And so we speak English from the very beginning, we write in English. And then historically, it was not as though these languages, let's say Islam when it came to India, spread into India gradually, Bengali and other Gujarati, lots of these languages, they were kind of Islamized, or, there are ways people, when the Hindu Muslims talk about, use that language in a certain way, and the Hindus would, like the case of Bengali, for example, a lot of literature, what called kind of Muslim Bengali, and a lot of literature is what people tend to identify as Hindu Bengali and so forth. There is overlap, but there is also there's a difference and so forth. But I think if it comes down to first the basic question of whether this language, can we just do away with language? I don't think we have to do away with English altogether, but yes, English. But again, it's about delinking from these terms the Western and kind of recent Eurocentric baggage that kind of tend to mislead people in important ways. So when we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about religion, we're talking about philosophy, science. Each of these words has a kind of, in popular context, kind of well-defined, not well-defined, but everyone thinks they understand. But what they understand is shaped by what happened in the last 5-6 centuries, epistemologically speaking. So there has to be an awareness and also problems if we stick to those kind of established ways of looking at things. So I think it's about at the popular creating awareness, but we can do so only by kind of questioning these terms and providing alternative definitions. So and this brings us back. This brings me back to what you were saying. So if we want to talk about spirituality, that would map that can be applied authentically to the Islamic tradition. What are the parameters? What are the indigenous concepts or words in Arabic and Persian you would look into? So I did exactly that, and as I try to explain, like for self, I went through all of these processes, and it's so complicated if we try to do them because there is a cluster of terms. That's why I came up with this idea of this spectrum notion of the self. But I believe something similar has to be. I've done the same to a greater extent for spirituality as well. So I was not trying to just work as a philologist because I was trying to reach a broader audience. So for me, it's not. I assume a lot of things like, all right, everyone perhaps knows that the word in Arabic or Persian and even Urdu and other languages sometimes used for spirit is ruh, ruhaniyat, ruhani. That's the that's kind of one-on-one translation. But then there are so many other words to talk about different kinds of spirituality, levels of spirituality. Irfan, for example, kind of gnosis, a higher special mystical knowledge. Ma'rifa, again, in the sense of mystical knowledge. And so many terms. So people has to see how these terms, whether many of these terms that are used to talk about spirituality in the Islamic tradition, by which I mean philosophy, theology, mysticism, including Shiite mysticism, whether they have a kind of common connotations. If they have common connotations, is there a kind of pattern that we can see? So I tried to, so that was my approach. And then I also looked at, all right, how do we understand the term in today? And initially everyone might think, oh, everyone kind of knows, which is like, oh, spirituality is spirituality. Sometimes nothing to do with religion, or even all the time, nothing to do with religion. But that's not true. There are still some people like Cottingham and Macpherson who define it in a way that would correspond to, that's kind of more friendly to religion, you might say. So for me, the range of things that would correspond to spirituality today, as I said, are self-trust. I would begin with self-knowledge. If I have to kind of talk about say this in terms of in order, self-knowledge, self-transformation, and self-transcendence. And again, if you want to unpack how self-knowledge would correspond to our terms in Arabic, Persian, and then as you already pointed out, Sa'ada, Kamal, and all of this in relation to perhaps self-perfection, human flourishing. Of course, there are lots of words for self-knowledge, even beyond the kind of literal word that we use in Arabic and Persian. So I didn't want to go through all these processes because for the uninitiated, this will speak to the philologist, but not to an average person. But I think it does, when I say especially emphasize the element of self-knowledge and self-transformation, I think it does authentically, perhaps in most contexts, capture what we have in mind. Because as you were saying, a lot of the times people talk about spirituality in terms of embodied practices, like even being more religious is like, oh yeah, I was not religious and now I became more spiritual, meaning I'm taking my prayers seriously and so forth. But that does not mean spiritual in the serious sense. That was one of my criticisms of Iqbal. No, Iqbal talks of, there are criticisms in Iqbal against Sufism, But Iqbal talks a lot about spirituality, philosophy, Sufism, and so forth, and even says, his thought was influenced by a lot of these classical Sufis. But I disagreed with Iqbal's notion of spirituality in the end, because what was lacking in his conception of spirituality was this dimension of self-transformation. I said that the Iqbal lays out all of these problems that we're facing as Muslim Ummah, etc. And he proposed a new concept of the self as a solution. This is all fine. This would probably work for most people at the kind of mass level, and that's all itself is very important. But Iqbal's project is an overarching project. I don't see, in that project, concrete set of spiritual practices that will actually, at least from the outside, kind of show that it can lead to some kind of solid self-transformation, which Ado and others talk about, and which Mullah Sadra, even this is all about transforming the ordinary self. And how does that happen? As you say, it's not just kind of I think I kind of flipped over the term last time, but it's not disembodied practices. These practices are embodied, but they're also not just internal, theoretical, mental games. They involve concrete practices. And what are these practices? Are they kind of concrete enough to kind of lead toward this process of self-transformation, which should be an important, one of the crucial elements of spirituality? So that was one of my kind of heuristics, if you will, to try to come to term to try to kind of reconcile different notions of spirituality, because otherwise it becomes too vague. Anything can be spiritual, any kind of quote unquote cosmic feeling that people often report, and maybe these are spiritual experiences, etc. But we're talking about something perhaps more concrete, a kind of methodology involving a set of spiritual practices, like meditation, again on different levels, that might kind of enable the self to transform itself. So that was my kind of strategy, and that's how I tried to encounter this. And I'm sure there are other ways to explain this as well. But it's at least, at the very least, I think this is an alternative. This is an alternative to those ideas of spirituality that just posit it as a kind of just feel good type thing, or simply disembodied kind of practices.
I mean, this precisely this issue of the spiritual practices being central to that transformation, I think is really important, and that's what requires the stress. So spiritual practices, not just as the exercise of the mind, but actually much more than that. And that's what you get from the Hadoshan tradition, but that of course is precisely, I think, what Mullah Sadra means when he's talking about riyada and mujahada. I mean, riyada and mujahada are not internal sort of movements, but they're rather, it's about the total self. And that's precisely this issue, isn't it? That one of the important philosophical inheritances we still have, regardless of how it might not be very popular anymore, is dualism. And the dualism sometimes even emerges in the Islamic philosophical traditions, but that dualism is not so marked in everyday life, and it's certainly not so marked in many other kinds of Islamic discourses. I mean, you don't find the same emphasis in Sufism, you don't find the same emphasis in Kalam, you don't find the same emphasis in the other tradition, and you mentioned things like Bedil, and Bedil is a wonderful kind of, reading Bedil is a wonderful spiritual exercise. I think that's something which is quite important. But then if I can just link that to this question that Najim's just asked, which I think is quite interesting, and this is about your third stage of that, which is a self-transcendence. So if we can maybe unpack the self-transcendence a bit. Now, as he rightly says, that kind of assumes that there is such a thing as transcendence. And the whole language of transcendence and immanence, I remember discussing this recently with someone, emerges really in German philosophy, right? But it's become such a common place. It's central to Western metaphysics, if anything, as you know, has been critiqued by Heidegger and many others. this fundamental question of how you square transcendence and immanence becomes the central problem. And it's not really good enough just to map that onto theological ideas of Tanzih and Tashbih, because I don't think that's what we're talking about. So when we are talking about transcendence and when we're talking about self-transcendence, what do we really mean by that?
Right. Now, this is a very good question. So I think I addressed it also in my book. I forgot the pages, but because this is a term, again, used in different contexts. Neo-Aristotelian philosophers also use these terms. The way I used it is different from both philosophers in the German tradition and also Neo-Aristotelian philosophers. But in general, if we think that this is about some kind of speaking in a very general way, some kind of sacrifice. In other words, there can be acts that we can perform that transcends our self-interest, self-concern, and that outweigh kind of economic cost or cost, that kind of cost-benefit analysis, instrumental rationality, etc. But it still gives us a sense of wholeness, a sense of spiritual, for lack of a better word, sense of satisfaction, trying to help someone without just for the sake of helping, without, so that, or making even something more substantial, like some kind of sacrifice and so forth. And there are actually sociological studies that show that even through these studies, one can see that people who tend to do these things, they tend to gain more satisfaction from this, contrary to popular expectation that you always act on your self-interest and so forth. So, all right, that can be a starting point to transcend a limited self, ordinarily understood as the ego, which is always kind of self-absorbed, always thinking about its own well-being experiences and so forth, always trying to define the world in relation to its own philosophy or whatever, life, etc. But this is about radical decentering in a way, because in this conception, deep down the self, there is already transcendence. Transcendence is identified as immanence. So this becomes clear when we have something like the idea of the perfect human, which is the idea that this is the highest degree of selfhood that Muslim Sufi mystical philosophers, but widely it was accepted by a lot of people beyond just mysticism, beyond just kind of what's called Sufism or philosophical Sufism. This is the idea that somehow at the heart of our being lies the possibility to reflect all the divine names and attributes. In other words, all the divine names and perfection, all the divine perfections, because at the center of our being lies the ray of the divine spark, represented by the greatest name of God called Allah. For the mystics, this name is different from other names of God. God has many names in Islam, as we all know. As-Sabur, the patient, on top of my head, Rahman, Rahim, so many other names. But this name is called Al-Ism Al-Jami'. It's all comprehensive name. God's names are not just 99, they're infinite in the widest sense. Those are the kind of stipulated names, 99, 101. But this is fundamentally about all the divine names and attributes. And the reason for the human existence is explained in terms of reaching that state, which is already reached by the likes of the prophets, great sages, etc. When one is able to attain that state, one is able to reflect be a perfect mirror for the divine, so that all the divine names and qualities are kind of reflected in that mirror. And when you look at, for many Muslims would point to the life of the Prophet and great sages saying, you can see the reflection of divine names and perfections, like how they behaved in contrast to kind of ordinary expectation, when, there are lots of such examples. So so you can see that, by self-transcendence, I have in mind something as aspirational as the perfect human, which I did talk about. It's one of the most well-known ideas. So it's a process. This only makes sense when we begin from the idea that when we're talking about the self, it's both normative and descriptive. And when you're talking about the normative dimension of the self, it's by definition sort of aspirational. It's about what we are now versus what we can be. depending on how we, live our life. What are the kind of assumptions? What are the key, ideas that kind of shape our life? This can be explained in terms of something like, like a work in progress. It's like taking one's body, mind, and spirit as kind of work of art in a way, while not negating the kind of, while not negating forces outside of it. Because oftentimes, in popular psychology, and even in Foucault, of course, sometimes you get the sense that, it's all kind of, self-cultivation in a way, life is an art. Techne to bio, in Greek, there's this notion of, art of, being in life. But this is definitely true. And it definitely depends on how we choose to define ourselves, what are the key ideas that kind of shape our life. But at the same time, in this process, it's a thoroughly interconnected. Human beings are not seen as kind of Cartesian, res cogitans, or Cartesian, beings kind of completely separate from the rest of the universe, nature, and God. No, they're constant interaction. That's why when, at one point I was trying to think about how to define or how to even talk about, because definition is always difficult, define the self in Islam. I was thinking about two terms. One is anthropocosmic and another one anthropocentric. So the first sense of self-cultivation, taking one's life as a work of art, is anthropocentric. It's deeply anthropocentric, and all the writings oftentimes are addressed to the individual. All of these practices that can fashion, refashion, mold, and remold ourselves into something different. It's like a seed in a way, except that when it comes to a seed, depending on the external environments, it can sometimes flourish, or sometimes, life can be wasted, except that it doesn't have self-determination. Whereas human beings, we have those self-determinations. But it's not just anthropocentric in the individualistic sense, it's also anthropocosmic, because this, human beings, when we're thinking about our starting point, it's not Cartesian ego, like we're thinking against everyone else, and somehow, that way we can come to really know ourselves and the world, and mind and the world, that dualism and so forth, which leads to further problems. In this world, everything, if you're starting from, trying to not get too complicated, but if you're starting from a kind of Sadrian ontology, epistemology is already grounded in ontology. Being is kind of so all-encompassing. One is not able to define oneself as a kind of Cartesian subject, which can then be pitted against everything else. That's just impossible, even theoretically possible, but leads to all sorts of problems. Here, the analogies of microcosm, macrocosm, metacosm, these are the words that they use in Arabic and Persian. And one can see that this is a thoroughly interconnected and meshed system, and human beings have to consider themselves in light of that already given interconnected system, not as disembodied beings separated from the rest of the world, and then kind of trying to figure out God, trying to figure out being, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a tall order, but once we have all of this assumption in place, perhaps we have a different notion of self-transcendence. It's definitely transcending the self through the self, but at the same time finding connections with everything else, because transcendence and immanence are not always kind of dichotomous here. Divine presence, in terms of the presences, 5 divine presences that people talk about, encompasses everything. So to talk about the self is not possible ultimately if we do not have the ontology and epistemology and metaphysics, in the background, because these are different epistemologies, different ontologies, and different metaphysical systems than the ones that we are sometimes familiar with.
Thank you. I want, Sajjad, if I may.
Yes, please. And apologies, I'm actually gonna have to leave. I do apologize. I've really enjoyed this. Hopefully, I'll catch up with it later as well. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Khuda Hafiz. So I think there's some point to actually championing. Actually, I want to take up the theme of language again in a couple of different senses. First of all, with respect to what we're talking about, I think there is, and this is strategic, really, in some sense, or even polemical, is that there is some point, I think, to championing transcendence in contemporary philosophy, which is completely dominated because of this dogmatic secularism, which is an entire ideology, which is constant valorization of the term immanence. Yeah. Of immanence and of the immanent. Yeah, this is transcendence. The very idea of transcendence, is like a favorite term of abuse. Yeah, I mean, almost. Yeah, it's like saying hocus pocus. Yeah, which of course itself is a Protestant, as I was telling my students just the other day while we were discussing your book. Hocus pocus is a Protestant polemic against Catholics, because they say hoc est corpus meum, so the Protestants, to make fun of the Catholics, say hocus pocus. So transcendence, actually, because what happened in the with Hegel, yeah, is that the transcendence, it's completely immanentized, and in the ideology of progress. So what you're basically, the ideology of progress itself is an ideology of immanent transcendence, which is absurd, of course, because it's the idea of historical salvation. Yeah, historical salvation. Yeah. So I think there is a point in this Protestant secular world in which we live, Protestant and secular world in which we live, to championing the idea of transcendence. But in general, in terms of language, so you work largely, of course, you're very erudite, and you're very familiar with the continental tradition as well, just like as is the case with Sajjad also. But the problem of language, so Heidegger, for instance, yeah, who is of course taking on the Western tradition, which is really the modern Western tradition, one should say. One should not co-opt the Heidegger himself makes this error, and as a result, he reads Plato very badly. One of the weakest points, I think, of his philosophy is his reading of Plato, as John Sallis, for one, has recently shown that he's got Plato all wrong. But Heidegger, in the way, so in order to get out of this, of course, he himself feels, yeah, that we are completely sort of embedded, really captured, captivated, imprisoned, incarcerated in these concepts and languages. So of course, then he develops a very different kind of idiom in speaking, and that's true of continental philosophy in general. So some discipline with respect to using words, yeah, or not using, rather more importantly, not using words. For instance, the word identity, yeah, which has completely come to dominate modern conceptions of the self amongst Pada Likha people. They're constantly using this word identity, yeah, which is of course came into existence just in the 17th and 18th centuries to refer to personhood. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense, because of course no one is identical to themselves. Right? And the moment you use the word identity, whether you like it or not, that idea of identicality, something being identical to itself, necessarily resonates in the language. Yeah. So some discipline, I think, in terms of the language one uses and how one uses the language. So, the Heideggerian tradition right through to Derrida is a kind of modernist tradition, just like the modernists. And modernism, I mean literary modernism, which is not a valorization of modernity, of course. In fact, most of them are very, very critical of modernity. Modernism here means not being trapped in the language of this post-Enlightenment period. Basically, the way European languages developed in the 18th, especially the late 18th and the 19th centuries. Yeah, so undoing or doing the work of undoing the work of those. So that's why they feel a lot of modern, I mean, in poetry, in literature, etc., especially, they rupture, what, and it can be in a variety of different kinds of politics. Yeah. So from one point of view, it's rupturing or disrupting bourgeois language. It can be, disrupting, because there are, of course, all these other dimensions. I mean, it's not just concepts that we are working against, it's an entire form of life. That's also where the question of practice comes up. Yeah, because these concepts are not just in our heads, they're the way in which our lives are organized, the form of life, you know. There's a book, David Wotton, who writes about, it's called Power, Pleasure, and Profit. Yeah, the appetites from Machiavelli to Madison. This idea that the purpose of life, yeah, is power, pleasure, and profit, emerges in philosophies in this time period, especially the 17th and 18th centuries, and now is completely taken for granted by everyone, and therefore determines our sense of self. I mean, it's so closely tied with actually our form of life, the global economy, the global political scene, etc. So, all of this. So that's why this embodied, for me, and this is the last thing I want to say to you. I mean, I have lots of other things because it's so provocative, all of your set of concerns. But the last thing I want to say is actually the reason that I was teaching this course, and the reason that we are reading this book, and why I think this is Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities. I mean, humankind, is in big trouble today. It's remarkable to me that people can continue to function as if we are not in the midst of this global catastrophe. Yeah, it's perfectly obvious that, in fact, this whole idea of Western, the Western episteme, which obviously the reason it carries so much prestige, is precisely because of, supposedly the glories of modernity. But it's it's a disaster. It's a catastrophe. It's not just a human catastrophe, societal catastrophe. It's a planetary catastrophe. It's brought on the sixth mass extinction of species, and of course we are a species. So you would think that it would make sense. And how? I mean, I worry about my students. How are they supposed to live their lives in the midst of this without some kind of strong sense of self? The problem is, and actually it's the more vulnerable self and the more ethical self that is the strong self. Yeah. So you haven't spoken about this, but to those who are listening, Professor Muhammad Faruque, one of the virtues, for instance, that he emphasizes is the virtue of compassion. Yeah, which is of course entirely ethical, simultaneously spiritual and ethical. It's impossible to understand from, if you read Professor Faruque's book, it's impossible to understand spirituality without simultaneously thinking of ethics. The two are inextricable from each other. And some of these practices that we're talking about also are practices of virtue, basically. So it's a practice virtue, practice compassion, for instance, to become compassionate, which of course does something to the self. It transforms it. Yeah. So those are some of the things. The problem is that on the left, and I see myself as being part of the left. The problem with the left is that they really, Marx himself had no ethical conception, as if politics would take care of everything. And then how are we supposed to cultivate ourselves? How are we supposed to sculpt ourselves? Yeah. And what is the post-revolutionary self going to be if there is a global revolution? How are we supposed to live our lives? How are we supposed to cultivate ourselves, and to what end? And that's the other question that you bring up in your book. Yeah. What is the purpose? What is the telos? Yeah. So those are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share with you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, honestly, you've touched on really the most important issues that concern all of us. So I completely agree. You mentioned, so I'll just say, nod my head, actually, starting with Hegel. Yes, there is. I mean, Hegel does not deny transcendence completely. There are references here and there in philosophy of religion, that multi-volume work. But I completely agree. There is an excessive, emphasis on immanence and the self-realization of the spirit, and Marx kind of turned it, as we all know, upside down, and it became a materialism, and then just material forces and class struggles and so forth. But Marx was not at least from my point of view, sophisticated philosopher. He was a popular philosopher, and that's why he's popular. Hegel, hardly known outside of the kind of specialists or scholars. But yes, in the Islamic tradition, if you look at the ontology, there are terms like wujud la bishart maqsami, and then wujud la bishart qismi, wujud bishart shay. So when talking about this ontology, there is, first of all, the absolutely unconditioned being. The reality which is simultaneously present and encompasses everything, but at the same time transcends all categories, names, and determinations. And then there's the act of being, which would correspond to what I just said, wujud la bishart qismi. And Hegel confuses intentionally or not, I don't know, but at least for him, that's the kind of essence of reality. He sees kind of manifestation of being, spirit, for him, spirit is, it's the ultimate reality. But then, the spirit also has a dimension which is the realm of non-manifestation. It transcends just material or otherwise manifestation. So there are levels, and these are subtle concepts. And that's why even someone like Hegel, I think one of the greatest philosophers in the Western tradition, probably one of the last great metaphysician, but still, did not manage to clarify some of these things. And so I personally feel like, these things had tremendous consequences. And then the question of language in both continental and analytic philosophy, it's no coincidence. Why is that, in the 20th century philosophy, there is this overwhelming, like unbounded interest in language. Everyone is trying to explain everything, all epistemology, everything through language and so forth, as if, even if when it comes to ourselves, ethics and so forth, we're all trapped in this, thoroughly complicated labyrinthine linguistic system. There's no way out and so forth. So there is some truth to it, the overwhelming nature of language, and even the critiques, many would point out, it's all kind of bound in this particular language game and so forth. But I don't agree. So oftentimes, at least when it comes to in the continental philosophy, their epistemologists take some of these things for granted. So if we ask the most fundamental questions about how we know ourselves, everyone thinks it's just through kind of subject-object dichotomy, through conceptual thinking and so forth, apart from some exceptions. But there is also what I call non-reflective, non-conceptual, pre-linguistic way of knowing yourself, knowing the world. Heidegger, because Heidegger also reads medieval and ancient philosophy and so forth, he distinguishes between the subject-object way of knowing things, or kind of categorizing the world, organizing the world, and kind of a more primitive way of relating to the world. So Heidegger is actually subtler in this regard, because the whole entire scientific edifice and a lot of this sociological analysis, a lot of our philology, a lot of these sciences, they're actually based on this subject-object dichotomy, which we try so hard, at least these philosophers, to overcome, because it goes back to Descartes. That's not the only way we can relate to the world, or we can organize our ontology. And actually, this is very problematic. So unless we ask those fundamental epistemological questions and see that there are alternative epistemic trajectories, paths that can actually get us out of this, this linguistic trap, the system of language. And there are a lot more can be said, especially in analytic philosophy. The epistemology is always based on kind of the historical storehouse of language that kind of made us come to the point where we are now. But that's how we can frame. That's the most we can think of. Language is the kind of all-encompassing entity in this context. But in other contexts, like Islamic context, people, when they talk about conceptualization in the sense of understanding, in the sense of understanding universals, intelligibles, you need an outside agency like the active intellect. And recently there's this amazing book by this Muslim analytic philosopher. It's called Avicenna and Analytic Philosophy, Knowing the Unknown. And he takes on a lot of these modern analytic philosophers like McDowell, Davidson, and kind of puts them in conversation in Avicenna, and kind of to kind of argue for an alternative. So I do believe there are those alternatives that kind of need to be there to kind of think about way forward. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. There's so much to say, and there are lots and lots of questions, as you can see. in the chat, which have been pasted here from the comment section in the Facebook, on our Facebook page. But unfortunately, we've run out of time. So, but of course, the comments are there. And Muhammad, you can go and respond to them if you wish on the comments page. Many of these are our students, Amna, Zayan, Kinze, Kiran. These are Habib University students, yeah, Afan, Dayan. So you can see that they've been reading your book and they're asking good questions. So there's lots more. You can also, of course, write to Professor Muhammad Faruque and be in conversation with him in that way. So thank you so much, Muhammad. That was really thrilling. I mean, and once again, I'd like to congratulate you again on writing such an essential text for our times, Sculpting the Self. And with that, I'll say Khuda Hafiz now.
Thank you so much for kindly inviting me as well.
Khuda Hafiz to everyone.